I woke up on Saturday morning truly believing that I was still 28 and living in Johannesburg. I was very disappointed to discover that I actually wasn't. It's a lovely read. So what we thought we would do was kind of chat together, we'd just have a conversation around writing the book and some of the issues that are inside the book for half an hour or so, and then throw it open to the floor, and hopefully we'll get some really interesting questions that will come out of it. And then I know a number of you have already bought books, but if anybody else wants one, Mark will then be very happy to sign and inscribe your books for you at the end, and you can all top your glasses up. So that's the plan. So I wanted to start, Mark, by asking you about how you became a conservationist. Growing up on Ashdown Forest, what were the things that really influenced you, that made you think that conservation was where you were heading?
As a child growing up in this amazing place on the edge of Ashdown Forest, I'm sure a lot of you know it, it is a truly special place, but it's not just the forest, it's the fields and the woods and everything that goes to make up the countryside. And gardens, very much a part of my life. My mother was a natural gardener, so I was very lucky to live in that place and to get all of those relationships with nature. So the idea of becoming a conservationist wasn't there at all. I had no idea of what that meant. The language wouldn't have been there. But what came first was a personal relationship with nature, and just by being in it and experiencing it in my own personal way. And over time, that led me to want to learn about nature in a more formal way, and that eventually, almost accidentally, led me to a life working in conservation.
And childhood reading? What were the books that really influenced you?
Yeah, well, that is true. I mean, books were really important to me as a child, and they started off with the most childish of books read to me by my parents, squirrels, and then it was just so stories, and all the magical kind of creatures. Then as I grew a little bit older, the most important in many ways personally was the Jungle Book, because I had this kind of fantasy of a child living in nature, and that seemed to be the most exciting possibility. And then as I grew older, then began to learn about what people working with wildlife, like the Jane Goodall books, were extremely important. So those all together created a whole set of emotions in me. That led me even deeper into the world of nature.
Lovely. And what did you go on to study at university?
Yes, well, after a momentary kind of flutter with the idea of studying English literature, which would have been a mistake, I'm sure, and then being a rock star, of course, we wanted to be. It was zoology, and it always had to be zoology, because although it was nature, in various ways, those books, perhaps most especially, made me think primarily about the animals. It was the animals, the excitement of seeing an animal, animals being there, wildlife in that context. So I studied zoology, but there was no reference within those studies to ideas of conservation at all.
It was before that, really, before the movement.
It was happening, and it had been happening, because I studied at the end of the 70s, and modern conservation movement in some respects began in 1962 with the Rachel Carson book, environmentalism and Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. That was all beginning to happen in the 70s, but it still really wasn't referenced in our studies at university at all.
There's a great Rousseau quote in the book. Is that a well-known quote in conservation?
No, not at all. I don't think so. I think it should be, but there's not a lot of politics in the book, but there are kind of some hidden political perspectives, and that is what the Rousseau quote is about.
Yeah.
So you've got to be really careful.
If anybody's interested in the land ownership debates at the moment, the Rousseau quote for me absolutely sums it all up. I don't think I can find it now, so you'll have to look later.
Yeah, it's in the book.
Yeah.
It's also in Rousseau.
It's also in Rousseau. Yeah. You want to go to your original sources. So you talk in the book about this dream of Africa, and that when you arrived in Africa as a young man, it lived up to your expectations. where did the dream come from? How did you develop childhood dreams of what Africa might be like? Was that from books and reading, or did you visit? Did you have family who visited?
It really came from books and from documentaries. That was what I learned, how I learned about Africa. The reason why it was always Africa is because those books and those experiences, all the best stuff was Africa, the elephants and lions and the good old books. It was all Africa. So that's why Africa was the place for me. And of course, I was quite mistaken, really, about what Africa was like. Because in all of those books and all those documentaries, there were never any people. People didn't feature as a part of Africa at all. And my interest was in the wildlife, so I never thought about people until I got there and discovered, of course, that Africa is absolutely full of extraordinary, wonderful people. But that was, I mean, if I say it was a surprise, that sounds stupid, but it kind of was.
That's really interesting. So what took you to Africa? What was did you go with a job that you were ready to go to, or how did you?
No, I was lucky. It's a very different world then than it is now. I literally got on a plane and flew to Nairobi because that's where the centre of wildlife was, to my thinking, because that was the safari industry. That's where you went. That was the Serengeti, it was the Masai Mara, it was the wildebeest migrations. So I got on a plane and tried my luck, and it was gambling, as we say in Uganda. I was gambling, and I was lucky, and I got the connection by chance that led to my next 35 years of working in nature conservation.
Yeah, and so began this life in nature conservation, and really, and so began the start of Beautiful Beasts and Beautiful Lands. So what drew you then to write the book at this stage?
It's a good question, and it's one that I hadn't really thought about enough when I was talking about the book, because I wrote the book quite specifically because over those 35 years of working in nature conservation, I had experiences that made me believe quite deeply that the way modern conservation worked and the principles in some respects on which it was founded were deeply flawed and couldn't be expected to successfully deliver nature conservation. So that is why I wrote the book. It's without sounding pompous or overly grand, it is a critique of modern conservation expressed through a personal tale, but the critique is real nonetheless. And so I do want people to read the book in order to understand my concerns about the direction that modern conservation has gone in.
Yeah.
And I can elaborate on those, or people can read it in the book.
Well, let's talk through it.
Okay.
Talk you through. When you were out there, were you writing a diary? Because some of the passages in this are so beautiful. You're driving through down a particular road or seeing a particular something, and I think, wow, is that from memory, or was that drawing on a diary or something that you were writing out there 20, 30 years ago?
Pretty much all from memory. I occasionally have tried to write a diary, but I'm not much of a writer, to be honest.
Wonderful. That's not true. He's a wonderful writer.
Thank you. But yeah, no, all from memory. But again, the relationship with nature is a deep one. So it all goes in there, and it's all in there somehow. So it's kind of emotional relationship that I guess comes out in representations of pictures and images and ideas.
The things you keep in your head. In many ways, Beautiful Beasts and Beautiful Lands is a consideration of the need for and the value of national parks. And there is a whole discussion about the separation between the natural world and the human world. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? How you think we've come to that as being the key to conserving nature, but to keep the humans away from the nature is the way to go about it.
Yeah, it's peculiar. It seems totally counterintuitive to me from a practical way of delivering conservation, and also completely at odds with how I got my own love of nature and had my own relationship with nature. It was by definitely being part of it. And nature in the UK is not separate. You can't separate people and nature. The movies, the books, the kind of representation of nature in Africa was very different, partly for all sorts of kind of colonial reasons, perhaps, but also partly because of this idealized concept of the national park, which came from, you know, the late 19th century from the US, where from small beginnings, if you like, it took over the world, and it embodied this principle that you needed to take people out in order to create this idealized wilderness. The concept of wilderness comes very much from the US, and it's a place without humans. So a lot of modern conservation has been based around that idea of wilderness. We couldn't do it in this country because there is no wilderness in this country. In truth, there isn't really any wilderness in the world, I think. But it's become embedded in the principles of modern conservation that you have to have this separation. But when you make that separation, you cut away all of these connections between people and nature. That in the absence of those, how are you really going to have much success in working with people to conserve nature? Because you've cut away all their relationships to it.
Yeah, you've moved them, driven them off the land.
In very practical, specific terms in Africa, you've driven them off the land. But you've also severed those kind of ideas of connection as well. You said, you know, conservation has to have none of that. So you don't really have a way to be part of conservation on your own terms. You can only be part of it on our terms.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah. Do you want to talk now a little bit about the beautiful beasts? There's a word which I can't say.
Yes, well that's, you know, I've got the reading that I'm going to give at the end is focused on that. But the title of Beautiful Beasts, Beautiful Lands, it represents, if you like, conservation generally, because all the beasts are beautiful, all the wildlife is beautiful, and the lands are beautiful. So conservation for me is very much about beautiful beasts and beautiful lands, but quite specifically, the pastoralist people that I worked with, looking at the relationship between those people and the particular national park that is the main story of the book, Lake Mburu National Park. Those people kept cows that they called Inyemebwa. And Inyemebwa, directly translated, means beautiful cows or beautiful bulls, or generalized beautiful beasts. And the way that they related to these incredible animals, extraordinary animals, was how they could then relate to the land and nature in general. It's what defined them as a people, the pursuit of a perfection, a bovine beauty, if you like. And there are pictures in the book of these, you know, 1 meter long, graceful horns, glowing white, the very particular red-brown colour that the cows have to have. That's what they've been breeding for hundreds of years, very, very specifically. And if you ask them, well, why that, why exactly that, they can only say, well, only because that's what our ancestors, the gods, the Bachwezi, which were their mythical ancestors, who had walked on the earth before they ascended to heaven. Actually, they went into a lake. But the beautiful cows were their beautiful cows, which when they left the planet, they gave to the people. That's why they had to keep them like that.
And so they had to keep them. And even though they weren't very good as milkers, did they eat them? Were they meat?
They absolutely did. They subsisted on milk and blood for every day, and then for whatever special reasons they would slaughter animals as well, and then they would eat meat. And historically, that would have been all they ate, nothing else. And they were so obsessed with the lives around their beasts that actually they had really strict food taboos. And if for one reason or another they ever ate anything that wasn't meat or milk or blood, they could not then eat milk, any of the things from a cow until they'd been ritually purified. So it was a really, really strict thing for them.
Yeah. So you found yourself, you went to Lake Maburu National Park for the first time in 1983, and you say in the book that the establishment of that park was could be considered the last and perhaps most disruptive manifestation of foreign interest in the land of Maburu, because it all went terribly wrong. And as the years went past, you managed to get yourself back to Maburu to then put together the reconstruction of the park. And in doing that, what you found really difficult was these cows continually being brought back onto the park. The people were pushed out, they were asked to leave, and they continually came back with these cows because of this belief that they had this mythic relationship with the land and with the gods, and that was so important, it kind of overrode everything else. So take yourself back to the second visit, which was 1990, when you were reconstructing it.
Well, we began that project in 1990, I guess, 1991.
And what had gone wrong? What was the aim of the project? Why did you need to go back to reconstruct the park?
Well, in 1993, the government decided to turn what had been a nature reserve, which was full of people doing all sorts of things, into a national park. And that was considered to be, a really good thing. The International Conservation Organization said, oh, that's really good, this is a really important area, let's make it a national park. Excellent. Every country was supposed to have its responsibilities for protecting its natural assets, and we still do. The national parks, if you like, was the premier way of doing that, so everybody is very excited. But as soon as you write the legislation, national park, then automatically, not just in Uganda, but kind of globally almost, except the UK, a national park means no people. So as soon as they made it a national park, no people. So an exercise was done by government to clear the park of people. And that became inevitably contentious and difficult and horrid, and people lost their lives and livelihoods, but it also became extremely political. So as soon as that government fell, the park was invaded, and the local people said, right, well, we're getting rid of this national park, and the best way to do that is to get rid of the wildlife, because that's why they made it a national park. And so that's what happened. And so the park was now fuller of people without any wildlife than it had ever been before the attempt to make a national park. So nonetheless, the government said, well, we'll keep a little bit of it as national park, and the rest we'll gazette and give to people, and will be farmed or whatever. The little bit that was remaining, the 1/3 that remained national park, was still full of people and cows and bicycles and fishermen and schools and wells and development projects. So that was the situation that we went back into to say, let's see if we can save the relics of this park through a different kind of principle, and we called it community conservation, which meant instead of having everything dependent on a fines and fences approach, we began looking to construct relationships between the park authorities and the local community. And we spent the next 10 years, I guess, or maybe more, 6 years, pursuing that approach.
And there seems to be the law of unintended consequences that continually ran through that. So I think you talked about helping people to settle somewhere else want to talk about that? And then they sold the land.
Well, yes, I mean, these things are inevitably complicated. So it was agreed that with the reduced size, and very particularly with farming communities that were quickly being, brought in to cultivate as much of the land as possible, that if there was going to be any conservation area left, it did need to be without agriculture. So we got agreement to basically compensate people for all of the assets that they had inside the park, and then to allocate them land outside the park. So that was all done. It was very formally done. There were counts and measurements, and bank accounts were set up, and monies were transferred, and then the people said, fine, now we're going to leave the park. The idea was that they were going to go to the land that they'd been allocated, but actually many of them didn't. They sold that land, and then they went and encroached on another protected area somewhere else. So
here you've got one piece of land of the national park that has been conserved, and then in turn your local forest has been destroyed and cut down so that these farming families can go and live there. And what about education? You had education projects that you were setting up?
yeah, absolutely. So I've always wondered about whether education was the right way forward, because I always felt that I was just, giving people my values in nature and telling them, you should love this. And we had all sorts of education around the economic value of conservation and how it's going to be in everybody's best interest. So all of these were kind of part of the education program. But in fact, the local community said, no, if you're going to give us anything, all these projects and activities that you're doing, education is the most important thing for us. So we want to have that element of the project as strongly as we can. So we actually built a 40-bed residential education centre where schools would be supported to come in, and we had a transport, and we would take people, students and local community members and whoever was interested, we would take them around the park and expose them to the park and its values as we described them.
And part of the rationale behind that project was to get local people to understand or to believe that the park itself was a source of economic benefit, that everybody could profit out of the park, and so it was going to be great for the local people that they had this resource that would help them to develop their way of life. Do you want to talk a bit about that, or where your funding came from, and the stickers on the cars?
The funding was all international funding, development assistance, but it was specifically, if you like, to support the national park. But a big part of the thinking at that time, and even today I come across it all the time, is this idea of what was called integrated conservation and development programs. And they really said, look, communities around our protected areas are poor, which was correct. Because they're poor, the only thing they're interested in is being less poor. And we will do projects to make them less poor, which will please them, obviously, but it will also mean that they are no longer dependent on the resources of the nature reserve or the national park, whichever it may be. And so by providing economic development, you could reduce the pressures on protected areas. Integrated conservation development. It was a deeply flawed concept, and it really didn't work very well in practical terms. But it created this rhetoric where we would go out to the communities and say, yes, this is your park. It's in your best interest to protect it and preserve it, because it will bring you a whole range of benefits. And by those benefits, we absolutely meant economic benefits, jobs or revenue streams or whatever it might be. And we tried very hard to make that work, to create these kind of win-win scenarios as they were described in the development world. And in some places you can do it, but in most places you just can't. So at that time, Lake and Buru, that we were talking about as a real destination for tourists, that would bring jobs and benefits. There were handfuls of tourists coming to Uganda, let alone Lake Buru. So it just wasn't a real thing.
And the earrings, I love the earring story. I thought that was fascinating.
Yes, well, the earring story is, if you like, was a critical element of leading me to the next phase of my journey, if you like. And that was that we would do these small development projects. We called them SCIPs, support for community initiated projects. And a lot of them were kind of social infrastructure, clinics or schools or investments of that nature. We would respond to communities' requests, but we also tried to do these small businesses, and all of these activities were designed, if you like, to create a positive relationship between the protected area and the communities and their benefits. And the one that was by any measure the most successful was that a group of pastoralist women, mainly, began using their traditional skills of weaving grasses and began making these beautifully intricate discs that then could be sold as earrings. And so that was going really, really well, and we started selling them. And then they kind of took it to the next level, where they started, inventing new, very beautiful kind of earrings, and those were selling really, really well. And this was really exciting. It was, as I say, it was a really, really good project of those kind of projects. And then suddenly it evaporated. And the women said, "Oh, yeah, not that interested anymore." And we said, "But this was really good. It was yours. The whole thing was yours, and it was really bringing you money." And they said, "Well, we got more important things that we need to be doing." And that was it. That was the end of that enterprise. They have more important things to be doing.
And the more important things were?
Well, they were things that related very much to the values associated and the aesthetics that related to being Bahima, that were very much embedded in the beautiful beasts and the welfare of beautiful beasts, but extended also to their own kind of larger aesthetic and focus on things that were beautiful. They needed to be beautiful, their homes needed to be beautiful, their management of their roles needed to deliver all of that. And although they were getting money, quite good money in the local context for these activities, and things they were making, were really beautiful, they just said, "No, this is not our priority."
Yeah, they didn't want that wealth. They want, what they got was richness enough for them.
I guess they had other ways to get money when they absolutely needed it, but as a day-to-day thing, sitting down to say, "Yes, we'll do these things in order to get money," we got better things to do. Yeah.
So how did that stage of the Maburu journey finish for you? What happened next?
Well, there were a number of things that made me wonder why we were struggling to deliver the outcomes from our, if you like, integrated conservation and development project. It had been successful in various ways, and as a project, people were very happy with it. But it was clear to me that it wasn't really working. That it certainly wasn't solving that issue that you mentioned earlier, that the cows were still coming into the park. Now, I didn't really worry about that, depending upon numbers, of course. At a certain point in time, there were so many cows in the park that they had to go out to find grazing. And that really didn't seem to make sense. So there were things that just didn't seem to make sense. So I couldn't understand them. The earrings was one in particular, the ongoing problem with the cows. And so I began to kind of think the issues that we're dealing with, although everybody talks about them as being a conflict of interest over resources, economic resources, I began to feel that actually wasn't the conversation that was going on. It was being the truth was being hidden by both parties of the conversation, and actually what was going on was an incompatible set of values, and if you like, that presented a very different perspective. Wouldn't be something that we could treat with economic benefits, because economics wasn't the issue, it was a set of values that were conflicting, and that was the issue. So, I mean, I was able to articulate that later in the process, but I began to feel that there was something here, and that's when I said, well, I'm going to do some research to actually look to see what is the basis of this conflict between the pastoralists and the park managers. Where's it coming from? Why would it go away?
And so you came back to the UK to do a PhD?
Yeah, I did. I registered in the end at a university in the UK to do a PhD. It was a strangely titled part-time, full-time PhD, which meant I had 6 years to complete it, and it meant when I was doing it, I was full-time, and when I wasn't doing it, I was part-time. So that gave me 6 years.
And that was what? Tell us a bit about.
Well, the research was described and defined as an interdisciplinary research. So I had different elements that I wanted to look at, and it was quite funny actually, because I would go to certain experts. My brother's father-in-law and mother-in-law were both anthropologists, so I went to them and said, I'm doing this interdisciplinary study. I want to look at the anthropological elements, the biological elements, the genetic elements. There was a whole lot of things I was going to look at. And I said, how can I go about looking at the anthropological elements? And they said, well, first of all, you spend a year learning the language. You then spend 3 years totally embedded in the community, and then you spend a couple of years writing up. I said, but it's only a tiny bit of the whole study. And they said, well, that's all you can do. Fortunately, I didn't take any notice, and I managed to do various different pieces of research that I could fit together to try and understand what was the nature of the conflict between Park and the pastoralists, and then to be able to suggest some remedies based on the understanding of, if you like, of conflicting cultures and values that could make a specific remedy for that national park. And then that allowed me, if you like, and that's the best thing about doing academic research, is it allows you to generalize. I hadn't been able to generalize my ideas at all. So I could only talk about the ideas with respect to the Bahima people and the Lake Mburu National Park and the beautiful cows. Outside that, I couldn't generalize it as an idea that this was about conflicting cultural values. But having done the research, that meant I could kind of apply this approach, the specific approach that we designed for Lake Mburu, if you like, to inoculate the park with cultural values associated with the Ankara cow, that we could use a similar approach in other protected areas.
Yeah. And so you went back to do that implementation. Were there any other factors that helped you make that work? Because Uganda was developing a lot at that time, wasn't it? With other parks developing and.
Well, by that time there were, when I started in Uganda, there were 3 national parks, and by the time I finished there were 10 national parks, and every time you created a national park, if you like, you created some of the same problems that were experienced at Lake Mburu. They didn't become so critical in many respects, but they were always difficult. So what I was able to do, again, very lucky, I joined a British conservation organisation at that time, and then sent me to Southeast Asia. But even though I was based in Southeast Asia, I managed to create this program that was called the Cultural Values and Conservation Program, that was managed through the Africa program. But it meant that I could come across moonlighting from the Asia Pacific program once or twice a year. So I still had my involvement with Lake Mburu, which was the core of what turned out to be a 10-year program, but which extended to several of the other national parks as well.
So as you came to believe that these people's local values, the local beliefs and traditions and culture, heritage, should be right at the heart of conservation. Did that shape your belief in whether conservation should be happening at all? Did you still believe in conservation, or did you throw it all up in the air?
I never lost my belief that nature conservation was absolutely essential as a practical, driven activity, because if you looked around the world, and if you still look around the world, you can see the implications of the loss of nature. So it never suggested to me that we shouldn't be working harder, as hard as we could, to find ways to protect nature. But it made me think about what the meaning of protection, and indeed what the meaning of nature was, in a very different way, and tried to recognize that I had my own relationship with nature, my own understanding of it, and therefore a way that, or something that I could bring to a discussion of how to protect it. But equally, everybody else did too. So we can have a protected area if we all agree to protect it. The reasons why we may agree together to protect it can be very, very different. You may have the values in it that you want to see protected, and I may have the values that I want to see protected, and other people may have other values. And as long as we can work together and be sufficiently flexible that not 100% of what I want will necessarily be there, 100% of what you want will be there, but by working together, we will together protect that place and all of its values, then we actually end up with something richer and more dynamic, and ultimately easier to protect, because we've got a whole lot of different parties saying we want this area protected. You don't have to say for what, you just say protected.
Do you want to read to us a bit from the book?
It's